them all what I'm made up. Strut down the hall, won't stop till I get enough.
Sometimes a headline just grabs you. The U.S. Supreme Court getting involved with a Trump administration deportation policy, focusing on Venezuelans. And the legal angle, it's apparently based on some 18th century wartime law. It just feels like something we need to unpack. So that's what we're doing today, this deep dive into what's actually happening, what this law is, and, well, what it means for the people caught up in it.
Exactly. We're mostly working from a BBC News report here, which gives a pretty good picture of the latest moves in the background. Our goal really is just to break down the key events, the legal arguments, so you, the listener, can get the essentials without getting lost in all the legal jargon.
Okay, so the core seems to be this law from, 1798, the Alien Enemies Act. What is that exactly?
Yeah.
Sounds ancient.
It really does. Essentially, the Alien Enemies Act gives the president some pretty broad powers, but specifically during wartime. It lets them detain and even deport citizens of a country the U.S. considers an enemy. And the really crucial part, it can happen without all the standard legal steps, the usual court reviews and protections people normally have.
Without the usual process. Okay, that sounds significant.
It is. And its history shows how unusual that power is meant to be. Applying it now when there isn't a declared war, well, that's a big step. It suggests a potentially new way the executive might use these powers in what they see as security threats.
And the BBC report mentioned how rare it is. Like, how rare?
Extremely. Before this whole situation kicked off, it had only been used 3 times, ever. And each time it was during a formally declared war, like World War I, World War II. So using it now, it really underlines why it's controversial, given there's no declared war with Venezuela.
Right. And the justification from the Trump administration, the report says, was framing this Venezuelan gang, Tren de Aragua. They called their activities an invasion or predatory incursion.
Yeah, that's the language they used. It's pretty strong stuff. And that framing is, well, it's absolutely key to understanding why they felt they could use this specific act. By describing it that way, they're essentially arguing it fits the enemy idea in the law, even if it's not a traditional state actor.
Calling a gang an invasion. That's a choice.
Yeah.
Is that even a defined legal term here? Or more rhetoric?
That's a great question. It leans more towards a rhetorical and political framing to fit the perceived requirements of the act, rather than a standard legal definition of invasion in international law. It's definitely pushing the boundaries.
But this isn't just theory, right? People are actually affected. The report mentioned alleged Venezuelan gang members detained in North Texas. What's their situation?
Absolutely. Their case is right at the center of this legal fight. The ACLU, the civil liberties group, they stepped in. They filed a lawsuit for these individuals, basically saying, hey, these people haven't had a proper chance to argue their case in court.
Okay, so what specifically went wrong, according to the ACLU?
Well, the lawsuit points to some really concerning procedural gaps. For instance, getting deportation notices in English when you only speak Spanish. That's a huge barrier right there to even understanding what's happening. And beyond that, the ACLU says they weren't even told they had the right to challenge the deportation order in the first place.
Wow. Not being told you can challenge it. And the report mentioned the potential consequences if they are deported.
Yeah, the lawsuit spells it out pretty starkly. It says without the Supreme Court stepping in, they could be sent to El Salvador, potentially facing life sentences there, all without a fair hearing in the U.S. on whether they are actually gang members or why they're being removed. So the stakes are incredibly high.
And there's been court action already. I think the article said a lower court blocked things initially.
That's right, yeah. Back on March 15th, a lower court did put a temporary stop to the deportations. They seemed to agree there were serious questions about due process. Then it went up to the Supreme Court, and they weighed in on April 8th.
Okay, and what was the Supreme Court's take then? Did they throw out the use of the act altogether?
Not exactly. That April 8th ruling was interesting. They basically said the Alien Enemies Act could potentially be used here. But, and this is the important bit, they also said that anyone facing deportation under it must get a chance to challenge their removal. It was like saying, okay, this old law might apply, but basic fairness, due process, still matters.
Which brings us right up to date, the latest Supreme Court order that the BBC reported on. What's the newest decision?
So this latest order puts the brakes on the deportation specifically for that group detained in North Texas. It essentially pauses things for them.
So after the lower court block and the Supreme Court saying, okay, maybe, but with due process, What does this new pause mean?
Well, the report doesn't detail all the reasoning, but it strongly suggests the court is taking a harder look. They seem to be examining whether those due process requirements they mentioned earlier are actually being met for this specific group. Are they getting that fair chance to challenge?
And the report notes Justices Thomas and Alito dissented. What does that signal?
Their dissent likely means they believe the administration is acting within its powers using the Alien Enemies Act here. They probably don't see a need for the courts to intervene further at this stage. It shows there's definitely disagreement on the court itself about how far presidential power goes in these kinds of situations, especially using such an old law.
And this gets even messier because, as the report points out, some Venezuelans have actually been deported already using this act, right?
Yes, that's a really critical piece of this. It's not just theoretical. As of that April 8th date, the report mentioned 137 Venezuelans out of 261 sent to El Salvador overall were removed under this specific law. So while this group in Texas gets a pause, others are already gone based on the same justification.
And then there's that really disturbing case, Kilmar Abrego Garcia. He's an El Salvador national.
Yes, his case is just. It's quite something. The government actually admitted they made a mistake. They deported him to El Salvador by accident, essentially. He's not Venezuelan. And his lawyer, his family, they deny the government's claim he's an MS-13. Plus, crucially, he's never actually been convicted of a crime in the U.S.
They admitted the mistake. So what happened then? Did they bring him back?
Well, despite admitting the error, the administration's initial stance, according to the reporting, was incredibly harsh that he'd never live in the U.S. again, which is pretty stark, given the mistake. Now, the Supreme Court did rule unanimously that the government needed to help get him back. That seemed like, a step towards correcting it.
But there was an update in the report, something less positive.
Yes, unfortunately. Senator Chris Van Hollen visited El Salvador, saw Mr. Abrego Garcia, and reported he'd been moved from that infamous mega prison, SCOTUS, but to another prison. It just highlights that even with the court ruling and the admitted mistake, his situation remains incredibly difficult and uncertain.
Just circling back to the administration's view for a second, the article mentioned Trump's second inaugural address pledge.
Right. In that speech, he specifically promised to eliminate the presence of all foreign gangs and criminal networks. That statement really connects the dots, showing the policy goal behind using tools like the Alien Enemies Act against groups like Tren de Aragua. It frames it as a direct fight against crime brought by these networks.
Okay, so let's try and pull this together. We've got the Supreme Court hitting pause, temporarily, on deporting this specific group of Venezuelans in Texas. The core issue seems to be whether they got a fair shot, due process, under this really old 1798 Alien Enemies Act, a law hardly ever used, usually only in declared wars, but invoked here against a gang described as an invasion. But at the same time, many others have been deported under it already, and we have this awful case of Mr. Abrego Garcia wrongly deported. It's definitely complex.
That sums it up well. And what's really striking, I think, is seeing this centuries-old law brought into play for a 21st century problem. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What does dusting off a law like this tell us about how we're balancing national security worries against, basic individual rights? And how could this whole case influence immigration policy moving forward? Or how presidents interpret their power when they perceive a threat that isn't quite a traditional war? It's definitely something worth keeping an eye on. And maybe for our listeners, it's worth looking a bit more into the history of the Alien Enemies Act itself and these bigger debates around immigration and fairness in the legal system.
Sound the alarm. I'm coming up. We'll have the ball. I'm sweet like a buttercup. You're Barbie doll. Show them all what I'm made of. Strut down the hall. Won't stop till I get enough.